Welcome back, everyone. After a lunch break, I hope you had a nice meal wherever you had it, and you are now all watered and fed. Um, and you've got plenty of questions coming up, and you've got your energy to be writing down your comments and any questions you might have for our speakers today. As I mentioned before, Jana isn't available. She was going to be the female panelist because of a family emergency. So we have our lovely panel here. Razi's going to be our chair for the Patriarchy panel, and I will pass it over to him. Just a quick mention first, there is a table full of material, some of which is free that you can take, and then there's also the Objective Standard, which are £10 a copy. There's 3 issues that you can buy as well. So there will be someone at breaks and at the end if you wanted to purchase a copy. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. So yeah, as Jennifer mentioned, we did have a female speaker for this panel. We actually, at some point, had two. I very much wanted to have a feminist on this panel, but unfortunately, there was only one who agreed, and then she changed her mind. And yeah, now we are basically left with an all-male panel. On the other side, on the other hand, one of our panelists is the world record, women's record holder for, what is it, deadlift and bench press. Is that the world or just the British record? All right, well, I think that still counts. And also, because we only have 3 of us up here, I moved one of the chairs, and now we can man spread on this table. One guy clapping, thanks. So, but yeah, in all seriousness, Jordan Peterson has made some profound points relating to gender. He's been criticized, possibly misunderstood for some of them. So our panelists discussing this today are Zubi. He is a rapper, an author, a podcaster, and an Oxford graduate. And we have Connor Watts, who is a doctoral candidate at Swansea University. So our first speaker will be Zubi.
I feel like I'm getting ready to do a performance here. How's everybody doing? Everyone good? It feels like the energy's a little somber. Everyone good, yeah? Okay, cool. That's all good. So, wow, talking about the patriarchy. So, I haven't pre-planned this too much because I wanted to come here and sort of see what the general vibe of it was, listen to some of the other talks, listen to some of the other speakers and see what the general vibe is. So I know this is an event discussing the works of Jordan Peterson, who I'm a huge fan of. I've been following his work for several years. I think I first discovered him late 2015, early 2016. I've been to one of his talks, had a couple interactions with him online, and I think he's doing the Lord's work. I think he's a great guy. I'm a big fan of a lot of his stuff. So what I figured, though, is in his absence, I don't really like to talk about people in their absence or make my own ideas about their own ideas. So I wanted to talk about sort of being a man in 2019 in general in the modern Western world, and talk a little bit about something that I feel the conversation generally in society is starting to shift a little bit more towards, but that is sort of the role of men and masculinity, because it feels like there are a whole bunch of concurrent narratives that have been running for the past few years or maybe even the past few decades, which I think has left men in the modern Western world in a little bit of a weird place. So I wanted to touch on some of those a little bit. So why do we need to talk about masculinity in general? I think it's really important given some of the data and some of the stats and just some of the realities that are out there. In the UK specifically, the biggest cause of death for men under the age of 45 is suicide. You've got 16 suicides per day happening just here in the UK. Very similar issues going on in Europe, in America, all over the world. Men taking their lives generally at a rate of 3 to 5 times as much as women do. And that in itself is a major issue that I think people need to take seriously and look at. there's a lot of discussion going on now about mental health and how it affects people, both male and female, and I think it's important that we have these conversations. Being a man myself, except for when I'm identifying as a woman to break records, I find that it can be weird to have these discussions because the narrative for the past several decades, you know, feminism obviously has had a very big push for, you know, the past 50 plus years. There's been, you know, a strive to empower women, encourage young girls, whether that's in education, in careers, everything like that, which is all good for the most part. But it seems like men, both intentionally and unintentionally in some ways, have been a little bit of a casualty of that, or a little bit of an afterthought. If you say that if you're in a university, or even at certain companies I've spoken to people at, they're saying that, for example, they've wanted to put together a men's society or some kind of men's groups, and they haven't actually been allowed to. So in their workplace, in their university, they'll have women's officers, they'll have women's groups, they'll have feminist groups and things like that, but in some of those places, they've actually blocked the efforts of men to be able to get together and discuss some of the issues that they feel pertain to them, or, you know, it's sort of laughed at, you know, in a way. You see similar things with stuff like domestic abuse, you know, if obviously women are suffering or are victims of domestic abuse, it's something that's taken very, very seriously. But again, if it's men and the incident rate of men being victims is not low, then there's something in society, both individually and as a collective, I feel, where people just don't take it seriously. It's kind of like, oh, you know, forget about guys, like let's focus on the women's problems, focus on the women's problems all the time. Pertaining to that, just out of interest, so before coming to do this, I was on Twitter just yesterday or the day before, and I actually just posted up a tweet, not expecting to get that many replies, but I posted up a tweet just simply saying, in your opinion, what is the biggest challenge facing boys and men in society today? And it got over 2,500 responses, which I wasn't expecting, but I think it'll be interesting to go through a couple of them. I have noted some of them down, both the ones that came from men and the ones that have come from women, just to see what people are saying out there and what the general consensus and opinions are. So, based on this question, once again, in your opinion, what is the biggest challenge facing boys and men today? So, I'm going to give you, firstly, some of the comments that came through from men, okay? Some of them fathers, some of them just, you know, men, brothers, husbands, whatever the case may be. I'm just going to go through these quite quickly. Being allowed to be themselves. Lack of a strong fatherly presence. We have no role in society unless we have the strength of mind to carve out a path for ourselves. We have lost faith and are too distracted with social value. This is corrupting boys and men to be something they're not, just to impress others. Self-esteem and self-worth. The education system in the Western world is increasingly geared towards blaming maleness for every current ill and past sin. Expectation of success and anxiety. Stress for your children and their future. Feminists that no longer want equality, but actively seek to diminish men's role in society and their future opportunities. Porn addiction, pop music culture, social media and smartphones. I have a daughter, and this is what scares me most for her regarding her future and finding true love, which I think is increasingly hard due to our distorted interactions and views of reality. The education system is the starting point for robbing young boys of their more primitive masculine drives. Lots of them feel lost and unappreciated. This provides a hurdle that many fail to clear. And the last one from men, these are just 10 out of thousands. The biggest challenge is simply existing. If you're tough and strong, you're toxic. If you flirt or try to date, you're a sexual harasser. If you value the traditional family, you're sexist. If you accidentally use the wrong pronoun, you're a bigot. You can't win. So that was just from some of my Twitter followers. And I think those are pretty enlightening. There's quite a common thread there. So what did the women say? Is it similar? Is it different? These are some of the comments I picked out from my female followers on Twitter. A society that deems they are wrong and dangerous because they're part of a toxic gender. Modern feminism, period. Being demonized by society. Being constantly told that there's something inherently wrong with their gender, and there isn't. Being seen as defective girls. Society demonizing men and feminists saying that men are irrelevant. Men should be celebrated for the difference and embraced by families. The words toxic masculinity. My son is not toxic and will not be made to feel inferior. Mental illness. The suicide rates for men are astronomical, and we need to find ways that treat men for depression that are more holistic and take into account the socialization to be staunch. I think for boys, it's growing up in a society where they're automatically deemed as potential rapists simply because they're boys. Growing up hearing that being masculine is a bad thing. And last one, besides absentee fathers, I honestly think it's the radical feminists of today. Men are constantly being told that they're the enemy and that they should be ashamed of being men. As a woman, I find this disturbing, and I've apologized for the way these women degrade males. So, yeah, that's quite heavy, but very enlightening as well. Out of those things, I sort of picked up on 4 of the things that I think were sort of common threads through there, and also in my own experience and observation and conversations with both men and women in lots of different places, even in different countries. The 4 things I've picked out are, number 1, the lack of father figures. Number 2, the demonization of masculinity in society. Number 3, lack of purpose and responsibility. And number 4, mental, and I also put in there also physical health, because I think the 2 are quite inextricably linked. So, to come back to the subject of the reason we're all gathered here today, I think part of the cause for the rise and the popularity and the celebration of somebody like Jordan Peterson, I believe, is actually linked to the fact that, firstly, he has opened up this conversation. As I was saying earlier, it's something that a lot of people don't really want to talk about. I think even as men, you know, being a man, there's a constant challenge of wanting to be the rock, both for your family or in a relationship or in any kind of group you're in, and having that level of stoicism and fearlessness and a degree of invulnerability. But I think one of the biggest challenges men face is sort of maintaining that frame whilst also having to deal with real issues and emotions and vulnerability. It can be hard to know how much to let out there to the world, right? If you're going through something that's really, really difficult, if you're going through some sort of issue that's happened, or some kind of loss, or something painful in a relationship, or some kind of depression, the pattern, and this is a global pattern, it seems to be that men want to be stoic and maintain that to a degree, and that's understandable, because part of our role is being a protector and a provider, and so you don't want to show too much vulnerability, which could be perceived as weakness. But this does mean that, you know, guys who are going through hard times, more so than women, are not going to seek certain help. You see that it, you know, when you combine it with some of the factors and some of the differences between males and females, for example, to take some relatively obvious ones, you know, higher rates of aggression, you know, greater, on average, physical strength, being, you know, less prone to certain types of emotionality, higher competitiveness. All of these things can be great characteristics when they are honed and they are channeled correctly and they're put into something positive. There's a phrase I've said many a times, which I believe I coined. I don't think I stole it from anyone, but I always say that boys and men are always building or destroying. Okay, so if you observe, I've got 9 nieces and nephews, and me being an uncle, just observing them in the different ways they behave is really fascinating. And it's really like that. If I look at my nephews, they're either building something or they're breaking something. It's just what they do. They'll be building a block of towers, or they'll be building a track to race cars on, or they'll be making a sandcastle or something. If they're not doing that, they're fighting, or they're knocking down someone else's building, or they're not. And this has been sort of men throughout society, in a way, if you think about it. You know, builders, inventors, creators, providers, protectors, but also warriors, soldiers, fighters. That is just the role. So I think that this can manifest in extremely positive ways for society, and I think for the most part it generally does. But I think we can all think of many examples, including some of the incidents that are happening right now. In the UK, you're seeing a surge in knife crime. Vast majority of the victims, vast majority of the perpetrators, young men. You're looking at the US, whether you're looking at gang violence or you're looking at some of these mass shootings that are happening, almost all the time, young men between the ages of, say, 16 and 25. Vast majority of people in prisons for violent crime. You know, there are certain trends, so you can see that when that male energy is not sort of captured correctly and channeled in the right direction, then it can be very destructive. Sometimes that manifests outwards to inflicting harm on other people, sometimes in horrific ways, and it can also be channeled inwards, as we've seen with suicide. So I think it's important for us to have this conversation. One of the reasons, like I just said, that I'm a big fan of Jordan Peterson and some of his work is the fact that I think that he has opened this up, and he has been, you know, this father figure that is lacking for both men and women, more so now in society than has been, which is something that I personally think is unfortunate. You know, someone before was talking about the archetypes and having this narrative, a positive narrative that both men and women can latch onto, because we all need something to aim for. So I think all of these things are extremely positive. I don't want to ramble on for too long because I want to give Connor a chance to talk, and I also think it'll be interesting to open up this discussion more widely. But in conclusion, two things I wanted to say is that it's important to restate that men and boys are not defective women or girls. We're fathers, sons, brothers, builders, inventors, protectors, and it's very important that that is recognized, and we don't let society crush that and crush men as a group and individuals at the same time, just as we would not want that to happen to girls and to women. And I think that in the latter case, we've done a pretty good job over the past couple of decades of moving away from that and ensuring that doesn't happen for the females in our society, which is fantastic. And secondly, to say that, you know, in this era where people like to use this term toxic masculinity, is I think that it's important that that's not conflated with masculinity as a whole. I don't think the problem is with masculinity. I think actually the bigger problem is with a lack of it, perhaps, and perhaps the masculinity that is there is not being channeled into the right directions with the right message and the right narrative. So that's what I've got to say on that. Thank you for listening.
Okay, so I'm just going to take probably 5 minutes just to outline a really important question I think that needs to be answered. Indeed, it is on the promotional literature, so I'm going to try and address that if I can. First of all, I'd like to say that Jordan Peterson, I don't think he is sexist. That's for the record, okay? None of his views, in my own opinion at least, are commensurate with sexism. He doesn't degrade women for a number of reasons. Also, pointing out differences between men and women is not equal to sexism either. You may disagree with his assessments of those characteristics, but that's up to you. But actually, I just wanted to put some evidence towards to suggest that Peterson is not sexist, in the sense that he says women's proclivity to say no more than any other force has shaped our evolution into the into the creative, industrious, upright, large-brained, competitive, aggressive, domineering creatures that we are today. As you may notice, that actually here Peterson actually accredits women with the development of our most valuable capacity, our ability to reason. So I don't see how that could be sexist. A common feminist critique of Peterson is that he likens femininity to chaos and masculinity to order, but as I outlined in my earlier talk, those are the fundamentals of his metaphysics, so they're both necessary. It's not, he doesn't say that one is better than the other, he just says that they're there and attributes to them in that way. The only other thing I would say is that whilst he isn't sexist, there is a slight problem, I think, in how his ideas will be taken on by his sort of fans, if you will. His idea of the innate dominance, which he likens to the lobsters memorably, poses a challenging question as to whether if groups are dominating each other, which is apparently intrinsic into our being with the ancient brain, which I mentioned earlier also, then wouldn't any reasonable person who accepts that premise then conclude that it's essentially dominate or be dominated? And I think we're seeing the conclusions of that today, where women have rightfully said that they've been oppressed in certain ways historically, and now their oppression is starting to tip over into men, sort of a tribal sort of warfare, an atmosphere of we need to dominate them or we will be dominated. So I do think his view of innate dominance may propagate that message, even if he doesn't intend it to do so. So I just wanted to posit that as the end of my comments in a way. Thank you.
Okay, Nikos.
Thanks. So, taking from Connor's last point about tribalism, the question to Zubi. By the way, first of all, respect for the records. I think what you're doing is very good. So, but here's the thing. Although I agree that it's great that Jordan Peterson has started this discussion, and it's very important that nowadays you can find these communities online where men try to find answer. My only worry is that sometimes it feels like these communities are mirroring some of the wrong elements of feminism. One is this almost victim status that we men are now kind of, women are basically oppressing us. And the way I understand masculinity is that part of masculinity is this rugged individualism, which says the world is out there for me to tame. And my problem is that when we view masculinity in terms of victimhood, this very important element is kind of lost. So the question is, do you feel that there is a danger that the whole men sphere on the internet is going to mirror some of the tribal wrong elements of feminism? Thank you.
My question is to anybody who wants to answer it again. One of the things that I noticed about Jordan Peterson in gender, which is very fascinating, is he's not really a typical conservative when it comes to gender, because what a typical conservative would do would say, okay, men, you have a certain psychology, women, you have a different psychology, so I'm going to give you advice based on having a different kind of mind if you're male or female. What I've noticed Peterson seems to be doing, even though he allows men and women to compete in the same jobs, or he allows for gender differentiation, for the guy to go to work and the woman to be a stay-at-home mom, almost all of his advice to men and to women is to encourage them to adopt more masculine traits. So he'll say to women, be more disagreeable, stand up for yourself. Mostly the same stuff he says to men. He never says anything which suggests that he thinks that there is a kind of feminine archetype, a feminine mind, which is positive but distinct from the masculine kind of good father figure that he almost speaks about like it's a kind of moral, political, and aesthetic ideal. So I suppose my question is, do you sense that there's a place for female psychology which is positive in Peterson's worldview, which is distinct from male psychology, or do you think that actually Peterson wants the stay-at-home mom and the guy who goes out to work to both be father figures?
I want to expand on what you just said. So if both are father figures and if both go to work, who will stay at home to look after the kids? Like, he doesn't have any advice for that, or has he thought about it? I don't know, I haven't read his book, so if you can tell me.
It feels like almost like systematic attack on men to make women hate men. I felt it's like every corner, like media, all this narrative. I always felt something bigger behind it. Why suddenly, as if society wanted women and men not get along? So, it's a question.
Hello. I I have a question, but I'd like to frame it first. I don't want to make it a sort of speech, but I do believe, and please don't judge me on the beginning of what I say, just wait for the end. I do believe that the concept of patriarchy has some element of validity, but I believe it mostly exists as a virtual construct within the shared spaces that we exist online. So traditionally, the newspaper of choice that I tend to read will be the Guardian or the Independent. And they seem to be the organs promoting this particular view, and so it becomes real in people's minds because they only see a narrative that supports that particular view. And from what I understand, most of the ideas behind this promotion of this idea of the patriarchy comes from a particular strands of the left, and only on the left. And what they seem to be are critiques and criticisms of the existence of the so-called traditional family, which I think is a slightly ridiculous term. I mean, people have families. There's nothing traditional about them. They're just families. They just exist. So I just wanted to know what you guys think of that as an explanation of where this term really lives. Because what they're actually criticizing, I believe, is just the way people live their lives and the roles and the actions that people take on in order to have a life that is fulfilling for them. Thank you.
Dr. Ben had a question, and then we'll come back to the speakers.
Thank you. I think my question partly follows on what's been said before. I mean, I sympathize with quite a lot of what you both say, but the great problem that bedevils all these discussions, I think, in general, is that of reliance on anecdote, and it's very difficult to go beyond that. I mean, if the worry is about male suicides, you will always be able to find thousands of men who've committed suicide, but most men don't commit suicide. If you want to try to find men who are domineering over women, there will always be examples of that. If you want to find examples of feminists who are obnoxious against men, you can always find any number of examples. There's no indication, it's very difficult to find any indication that these examples are representative of the male population as a whole or the female population as a whole. And until both sides, if that's the right term, in these culture wars actually start looking at the questions empirically and realizing the pitfalls of anecdotalism, I suspect that each side, as it were, will go on spouting their own selection of truths, and the other side will spout their own selection of truths. And what we need is some way of mediating to see which side or which inclination is closer to reality as a whole. But I don't know whether Peter's helped us do that. Maybe he has a bit with his scientific studies, but I think it's a problem we've got in our culture.
Okay, cool. Thank you for your questions. I hope I've noted down enough to address all of these to the best of my ability. So I'll actually go through them in reverse. So starting off with you were mentioning, obviously, we're talking about being quite anecdotal in the phrasing and not looking at the empirical data. So I think there are quite a few trends, many which have been talked about. I don't know if you've come across a book called The Boy Crisis by Dr. Warren Farrell, who was actually a key figure initially in the feminist movements of the 70s and 80s, who's now gone on to start talking a little bit more about issues pertaining to boys and men. And there are actually various areas where they're showing that boys and men are essentially falling behind. Some of the key ones would be dropout rates in school. If you're talking about things like depression and suicide, those rates are actually rising. There's an increasing problem of that. I know with suicide amongst both men and women, I believe, is increasing, but I believe increasing quicker for men. And then some of the issues like self-harm are affecting girls more now. I was recently at my girlfriend's graduation, and she studied sociology, so this is not representative at all. I'm sure if I went to a computer science degree ceremony, it would be the opposite. But about 12 to 1, the degrees going from females to between women and men. I know in the U.S., I think about 60% of overall undergraduate degrees now go to women. Lots of men are dropping out of universities, and I think even in terms of the anecdotal aspect, as a professional musician, I'm someone who does spend quite a lot of time just talking to young people, and by the thousands, and sort of seeing what both online and offline, and seeing where their general heads are at. So this is hard to sort of quantify and put a number on, but there is this common thread of young boys and men, young men in particular, just seeming very directionless, rudderless, not really knowing what they're supposed to be aiming for. So, in the past, I think sort of throughout history, for our fathers and for my father, my grandfather, and going all the way back, I think the role of a man in society and the role of a woman in society, for better or worse, I think there's pros and cons to this, were fairly well defined. If you're a man, get educated, get a job, get married, have a family, go to work, look after them, and the roles were a lot more clear cut. So that there's some benefit to some of that not being as strict or as rigidly as enforced as it is now. But I think it's also led to this situation where you're kind of in this new world where a lot of young men, or even men my age, in their early 30s, a lot of people are quite put off by marriage. Quite a lot of people are put off by the idea of having children. There's lots of various reasons for this. So there's this just, kind of confusion and misdirection there. So I don't know how clear an answer that's been, but I think, talking about someone like Jordan Peterson in particular, whether or not people agree with everything that he says or certain ideas and statements that he's made, I think what is important is he has laid out, like, look, you need to take control of your own life, stop looking outwards and blaming other people, become the best version of yourself, carry that burden, and strive. Don't just sit at home in your boxer shorts playing video games, or twiddling your thumbs, or whatever it is you want to achieve. Even in terms of being attractive to women, you've got to go out there and pursue that, and that's a narrative that I think has been missing a little bit in society. So I'm glad it's back. Do you want to go back and forth on the answers, or do you want me to go through all of them? Yeah. Let's go back and forth. I've also got. Should we just do? Yeah, we'll do it like that. Yeah.
Maybe use some of.
So just to address the second question, I would just say that I actually think he wants traditional gender roles. I don't have any textual evidence to support that, unfortunately, right now. But I think if you do read 12 Rules for Life, he makes it clear that maybe not exactly all women should be in the house and all men should be in work. That is the preferred that is the preferred setup, because it's been tried and tested. So I do think that he wants traditional roles, if not to the extreme, then he does want them, at least in part, or at least he implies that. The first question, though, I would like to say that I do think women as agreeable and all those kind of like typically feminine traits are sort of arbitrarily ascribed to women in a way. I know lots of tenacious, ferocious even women, and lots of timid men of all ages, so it's not necessarily because some of them are younger and they feel oppressed. What I would suggest, though, is that the reason, in his defense, to be fair, actually, is the reason he prescribes masculine traits is because they are not just masculine as such, although that's how we understand them. It's because they are applicable to all human beings all of the time. So if you were if you were very agreeable, how would you fare in a job? If a woman has a job, she needs to not be agreeable too. Do you see what I mean? Yeah, cool. That's all I have to say about all of the questions, actually, so take the floor.
Cool, yeah. So I'll go through, I think the first and third questions I can try to tackle together. So the first one that came from the back there. Yeah, I think there absolutely is a danger. I think what often happens is in situations where people rightly or wrongly feel marginalized or oppressed, what often happens is that they begin to seek vengeance and retribution rather than equality. I think this is a huge mistake that's been made in a significant chunk of the feminism in general. That's one of my biggest criticisms of feminism, is that it's in some ways, it's a wide sphere. I don't like to talk in such broad brushes, but there are certainly aspects of it where it has turned from being, we want equal rights under the laws and fair treatment to, men have dominated us or oppressed us, so now let's dominate or oppress them, and let's call men trash, and let's call them toxic, and let's try to rip them down rather than build ourselves up. And I think you're absolutely correct that, again, in certain fragments of the manosphere or, men's rights activist groups and stuff, you do see that same backlash and, hatred and division. It's just this venom. And I think that's a big problem. Bringing in your part of it as well, because you were talking about, it seems like there's this sort of systemic hatred of men, and you're asking about the division. I think that this ties into a wider topic, and that is just of the politics of identity in general, just these identity politics. Everyone who knows me knows that I've called identity politics a cancer upon society, and I don't say that lightly, right? Whether you're pitting black against white, men against women, straight against gay, I hate all of it, to be honest with you. I really, really, really dislike it. I think it's extremely important to treat everybody as individuals rather than as collectives or as groups. So whenever people start using this kind of rhetoric where they're just lumping all men or all women or all black people or all white people or all non-white, and you're just talking in these ridiculous ways, I just don't think that anything good comes of it. I mean, whether you're a man or a woman, you should want the other sex to be doing well, right? There's this idea, this panel is called the Patriarchy. There's this idea that, we men globally sort of gather at annual meetings and we sit there and discuss how we're going to oppress women and make their lives worse and make sure that our sisters and daughters and mothers suffer, right? And this is just this ridiculous narrative that you hear peddled, and people talk about it, and it's just like, no, that's not what we want, right? I've got 2 sisters, a mother, sister-in-laws, 5 nieces. I want the best for women that women can get. That does not mean that men and women are the same and they're completely identical and that they don't have individual concerns. But it's weird. Sometimes I talk about this stuff and it feels weird to me because it seems like what I'm saying is really, or it should be really obvious and just kind of accepted, but sometimes people push back on it or say that's controversial or whatever. So I think it, to conclude on that, it comes back to just, unity and harmony, and striving for that, and striving not to demonize other people on these traits and not fall into this continuous trap of just pointing the finger and saying, aha, the problem is women. Oh no, the problem is men. The problem is this. The problem, and it's like, and again, this is part of why Jordan Peterson's been so popular, is because people have been feeling this building over the past couple of years, perhaps even over the last decade, and it's like, oh gosh, finally someone is just speaking common sense and challenging some of these ideas that have been embedded in schools, in universities, in certain subjects, in certain parts of academia, where you're just, arbitrarily splitting the population into these groups and setting up these little power battles, and sometimes they're just imaginary. I've had this conversation with people across different lines. I have this conversation all the time when people are talking about race, people are talking about gender, people are talking about whatever, and the solution is really, really simple. Just treat people as individuals and try to treat people well and treat people fairly. And I hope everybody agrees with that.
There are 3 different things I would like to say. I don't know whether I can say 3 things. The first one is that I just wonder what is the panel's view, or what is the view about all different kind of sexuality? Because if we're talking about masculine and feminine, and we know that there is actually 10 different kind of things, how does it all fit in your picture with masculine trait and feminine trait, and masculine role in the family and feminine role in the it's a little bit sort of outdated for me. The other thing is, sorry, my mind goes blank when I talk. Maybe that's a feminine trait. But what you're saying is that you got sisters and can't remember, daughters or nephews and nieces, and you want the best for them. And how can we say that you are not? I can't remember the word what you were using. But I wonder when your sister goes out for a job and then gets half of the salary when a man in the same capacity gets. Do you stand up for that? Because you want the best for her, and she does the same, and she's never going to earn the same. Or if you go into a company and all the CEOs are men, and then there's one woman who we can put her in the window that we got a woman here. Do you stand up for that? Because I think generally, statistically, as far as I know, the empirical statistics would say that there is a big difference between salaries and positions and things that women can achieve in society. The women who you want the best for them. It doesn't mean when we talk about sexism in society, it doesn't mean we want bad for them, or we want bad for men, or we want bad for women. And or any conscious decision that we make, when if someone comes in here and says they want to speak, we want to listen to them, whether women or men. But all the unconscious processes that goes on while all that goodwill happening, it needs to be challenged. And the third thing I wanted to say is I will remember in 1 second. I thought it's quite important. It's a shame to miss out on it, but maybe later I will remember it.
Hi, so a couple of points I wanted to ask. Do you think that there's a bit too much focus on gender altogether, because you say you hate identity politics, but then we're going round in circles, keep talking about gender? In a way, I find the whole thing rather silly. And in terms of the education, trying to push differences between boys and girls rather than focusing on individuality of each child and what makes them happy and how to pursue their own passions is more important. But then the other question is a bit contradictory to the first point, is that the majority of educators and caregivers are female during our lifetime. I wonder if that has a very big effect on the idea of masculinity in society at the moment. And then I just wanted to make a point from what that lady just mentioned about lack of women in CEO positions, only because I used to work in corporate and I was on a fast track to be higher up. And a lot of people view success in life as being a CEO or being a top earner for people, but how do they really determine what's best for each individual person? And a lot of women want more freedom and want more time, and that in itself is worth more than money and the responsibility of being a CEO. So I think we're more sensible in many ways than men because we choose the better path.
Sorry, just one more comment about toxic masculinity. I think either I misunderstood you, but I felt that there is a confusion about what is toxic masculinity. Toxic masculinity doesn't mean that masculinity is toxic. Toxic masculinity is a side of what society at the moment calls masculine, and it's toxic. And masculinity itself is a wonderful thing. but some people practices in such a way that it is becoming toxic. All the violence, all the emotional retardment, almost like the lack of emotional development. Um, the alcoholism, these are the toxic side, these are toxic masculinity, but it doesn't mean masculinity is toxic. And it doesn't mean it's an attack on men or the denial of their right to be, statistically at least, different from women. I wouldn't say individually, there are
We do want to get some more people in, so Audrey had her.
As I was listening to George made a comment earlier and Jen, I was wondering actually if the discourse around gender is missing the point. For me, we've almost gone beyond that. I see that as a crisis of care in society, because what I hear around the discourse around gender is that there is push for masculine attributes such as aggressivity, competitiveness, assertiveness, etc. That is now that a lot of women want to show and are encouraged to show. But the feminine attributes are not valued as much, I feel, and therefore what happens is that because the caring notion is not valued enough, I wonder if this is a reason why we see a lot of people not interested in having children anymore, a lot of the fertility rate going down, because actually, as George said jokingly, if everybody's busy earning big bucks at work, who's going to look after the children? So I think that's a valid question when you think in terms of gender and what comes after, beyond that, for society.
I have one more observation to make on this, what I see as a virtual idea, this idea of patriarchy. It's a rather uncomfortable observation. It's not something that I share with people very often, definitely not in sort of open conversation. It tends to be the sort of thing that I observe with people that I'm already sort of roughly on the same page. It's born out of an experience. When I was 18, I moved to Brixton, which is in southeast London, big Afro-Caribbean community. The first time I met people from lots of different countries and cultures and everything else. I was working for a publishing company, and there was a women's commune that was around the corner that was populated just by women. And I had an experience. There were 3 women who used to come into the comic shop that I worked in, and they were all lesbians. And I had a particular experience, which one was really cool with me. We got on really well. One was quite ambivalent towards me, and one was quite hostile. And the one that I got on very well with, because they didn't have a lot of money to run their centre, so I got a load of the people that were coming into the shop, and I arranged about 8 people, and we went there and we spent a day painting all the rooms and redecorating it and making it good for them. But it was the day that I spent in the commune with these women was the first time that I ever came across people talking about the term toxic masculinity and also the term patriarchy. And a friend of mine about a year and a half later, started doing a degree in, I think it was then called women's studies rather than gender studies. But it always struck me that there was a particular section of the women's population that these ideas seemed to find a groundswell of popularity. And what I experienced critiquing these ideas or talking about them is that there's an enormous difficulty looking a gay person in the eye and saying, I disagree with you, especially when they're talking about issues to do with sexuality. There seems to be a very strong feeling, especially on the left, of supporting that view no matter what, because it comes from, if you like, the expert community that speaks on some form of authority on it. I've always found that quite curious, but that observation and that particular viewpoint, I think, does tend to bear out, which is difficult, because if you have a particular section of society, and I say this My family background, they desperately wanted me to be Roman Catholic, and I never took to it. But I've observed a similar thing when I lived in the Republic of Ireland. People will find it very difficult to look at an authority figure, especially one who speaks on issues of morality, and say, no, I disagree with you. Watching my uncle telling a Roman Catholic priest that he was wrong in his particular views on gay people, say, was really like, it was stunning, because I'd never seen anyone disagreeing with a priest. It was like, it was an astonishing thing to see. But anyway, that might be some food for thought. But it's a difficult topic, I realise.
Thanks. I work as a psychotherapist and I specialise in couples work. So what I'm doing every day is seeing couples in the room, trying to make sense of relationships today. And very often they're quite confused about how gender roles and relationships, how they should make them work. For people growing up, I guess, in our culture, the traditional version of our culture, which is, I guess, what people mean by patriarchy, although I don't tend to use that word. There are two things that can happen to children as they grow up. One of them is to be told that they're one down, that they are in some way the defective version or subordinate or something like that. Or the opposite is to be kind of falsely inflated, falsely empowered, told that more is expected of them. And what seems to happen to girls in our society traditionally is the first of these, that they're, in some way they get the idea that they're one down, and they then may react to that in different ways. You might expect me to say that what happens to boys is the other one, that they're falsely empowered, but actually it's more complicated. What happens to boys is they get a mixture or an alternation of the two things, so they are left confused. Some of the time they're being told you're bad, and some of the time they're being told you're good. And they end up in a sort of confused position which freezes them in a sort of childhood state.
So just trying to gather all my thoughts on these. I think to touch on a number of the different questions. First of all, I'd like to reiterate my point from earlier that I think these masculine, feminine traits are arbitrarily attached to men and then attached to women. So I think in answer to your question, when you say they're taught to either be this or that, to be aggressive is not right anyways if you're a civilized person. So to suggest that to men, oh, it's good to be aggressive, or it is wrong. Men need to be level-headed and all the other kinds of things that you would expect from a civilized person, just as much as women do. And then also, I think, touches on your point. The fact that they're arbitrarily attributed then leads to the question of why are we so focused on that? Why do we attribute these things to them when it's clearly evident? None of the men in this room, if there was a queue for the questions, you wouldn't all just be aggressive and try to get your own way and stuff. You would all be civil and carry yourselves appropriately. I don't get why we're there yet. Is there a focus on gender too much? Yes, for the same reason. Only real oppression needs to be dealt with, and you can't just sort of blanket term everything else as, I can't remember who said it, but they said that certain aspects of the left, and the right as well, in a different way, try to push things even though they know that they're not, or they don't want to let go of them. So a classic example would be a modern feminist, say, trying to propagate the idea of historical oppression against women today, which is, I don't think that's the case. I actually think, in terms of the pay gap, the Office for National Statistics found that in part-time employment, women now earn 4.4% more than men. So I don't think those kinds of things can be attributed to patriarchy at all. And then I would like to just finish by dealing with your point about the views of masculinity and femininity and how that relates to individual rights. If there is oppression on either side, the point is not to be tribal about it. So if women need, if a woman is wrongly oppressed in some way, then it doesn't benefit the men to then try and say we need to oppress more or to propagate that message. You should once the rights apply to everybody, and if you allow one person or one group in this case to lose their rights, then you forfeit your own eventually. So I would just like to finish those with that then.
Thanks for all the questions. I hope I made enough notes to remember and address them all well, because for every single question, my brain was immediately like, ooh, I want to say something there. Okay, so I'm gonna go through them in order. So, sorry, who was it that asked the first question? Do we remember? The first question was, oh yes, of course. You were talking about when I said something about me wanting the best for my sisters and my mother and my nieces. My sisters are, one of them is very senior at UBS Investment Bank, and the other is like very senior at an NGO, so they're probably really bad examples for, oh no, yeah, I know, I was just saying, so I think your core question was, I think, just about sex discrimination in general, yeah? Any kind of discrimination, regardless of where somebody sits, anywhere reasonably centered on the political spectrum, we all oppose that, all right? I'm opposed to sexism, I'm opposed to racism, homophobia, anything like that. In universities, hiring, daily life, it doesn't matter. Is there a degree of it? There is. I don't know how far it goes. Obviously, me being a darker skinned person, there are people who think that, I don't believe that the UK or, you know, any country I've been to in Western Europe or say in America or Canada, I don't think they have big racism or sexism problems. For perspective, I lived in Saudi Arabia for 19 years, and my family background is originally from Nigeria. So when people want to talk about things like patriarchy in the UK, I'm kind of like, where? What's being discussed here? So, sorry. Okay, what's the? Oh, if I stand up to it, I'll always stand up to any kind of unfair discrimination. I think most people will. But I think it has, sorry? Yeah, no, I mean, the problem with some of the way these terms are used, you see the same thing when people are talking about racism. You'll often hear people say institutional, systemic, you know, these different kinds of racism. It's kind of like a ghost that's just in the air, right? People won't point to something specific. If someone can point me specifically and show sex discrimination or racial discrimination or homophobia, whether that's at a university or somebody being hired for a job or anything like that, I will stand there and I will fight with them. But if they're just talking about this general idea that the UK is just a racist society, that's completely unhelpful. It doesn't give anyone a place to stand or anything that they can direct their energy towards and challenge. I don't think people are generally accepting of that, but I think people need to be able to challenge something specific. So if there's a policy or a law or a rule or something like that which is discriminatory, I think most people do challenge that in reality. But if we're just talking very generally, it's very difficult to do anything about. So that would be my answer to that. There was a question on if there's too much focus on gender altogether. Where did that come from? Yeah. I think yes and no. I think, again, coming back to my original point, I think that what we want to achieve, and I think what the Western world, you know, certainly on a historical and a geographical worldwide basis, has done incredibly well, actually, is knocking down those barriers and creating equality of opportunity. I do not personally believe that regardless that in 2019, I honestly do not believe that your skin color, your sexuality, or your gender is going to significantly hold you back in society if you want to pursue and achieve something. I genuinely don't believe that. I don't think that that was absolutely not always the case. There are certainly no laws or policies I'm aware of that discriminate on the basis of those things. That doesn't mean that you won't get individuals who are still bigoted in some way, but generally I do not think that it's tolerated. So I think that the sort of nuance here is I think that you want to treat everybody as individuals and have total equality of opportunity as much as that's possible. But we also need to understand and accept that if you give people equality of opportunity and freedom of choice, you're not going to get equality of outcome. People are not all going to follow the same thing. Everybody is different. And if you want to generalize between men and women, of course, there's huge overlaps, but generally, men's interests and proclivities are different to those of women, as you've sort of already addressed in what you were saying. And then there was the question about how success is defined. I totally agree with you on that. I find it weird when people completely focus on the financial element of everything. It always comes down to how much is that group earning or this group or that person earning. And I'm always like, why is that the only statistic that people are looking at? It's totally ridiculous, right? You know, if your goal is just to earn as much money as possible, then you may pursue certain things that you don't want to do. You may work more hours than you don't want to do. You may make sacrifices, not having relationships, not seeing your children, not looking after your health that you don't want to do, right? I mean, I used to be a management consultant before I went into doing music full time. And I can tell you, I took a gigantic pay cut to do that. But all of my friends, many of which earn more than me at the moment, they're envious of me because I set my own schedule, I've got the freedom, so I made that sacrifice of like, okay, what's important to me individually? If what's most important to somebody, whether that's a man or a woman, is looking after their children and raising them, maybe even homeschooling them, which is much more common in the US, then I'm like, awesome, like that's totally cool. So I think one of the mistakes that's been made by feminism over the years actually has been, this touches on something someone else was saying about feminine traits being less valued in society. I agree with you, because the narrative has to be like, look, men are doing these things. This is what men are doing. That's how much men are earning. Look at these male CEOs. You need to be like them. And there aren't a lot of people, even men. Most men don't want to be CEOs of companies. And absolutely most women don't really want to do that either. They don't want to be working 80, 100 hours a week, not being able to have relationships, not being able to have, sure, if someone wants that, they should have the opportunity to do it, but most people just don't want to. So I think that's touched on a couple of them. And then last couple I'll try to touch on. The idea of toxic masculinity. I understand what you're saying there, and I do understand that is how I think that's how what the term is supposed to mean. I think the problem with the term itself is that it could just be described as toxic behaviors, okay? There's no term that's toxic femininity, right? If someone wanted to create a term of toxic femininity, they could, but nobody does. The problem with the term toxic masculinity is it suggests, even if that's maybe not the intention, it does suggest that there's something inherently toxic about masculinity or something wrong with it, which is why I believe there's such a strong pushback against it. And I think it would be interesting to question. I'm glad there's no such term as toxic femininity. I don't want that term to exist because I don't think it would be fair in the way it's interpreted towards women. So I think that's why people have an issue with that term. I think you could say that there are criminal and toxic behaviors that people can exhibit. I don't see why that's linked to men nor masculinity specifically. And last two, there was one of the virtual idea of patriarchy. I would say that's very similar to some of these other quite left-wing academic terms such as white privilege or male privilege and all these other, which I think they're all bunk. I'm not left-wing at all, so I can say this stuff quite aptly. Right, I've had people, again, ask me what are my views on white privilege, and again, I think these are things that, the reality is, whatever filter you view the world through, that's how you're going to see things. If you believe that you live in a racist, sexist, homophobic society, you'll start seeing that you see these things everywhere. If you believe that the UK or the USA is run by white supremacy and white dominance and all the white people have white privilege and all that, right? And there are people who believe this, then they start seeing the world in a much more racist, sexist, bigoted way than somebody like me does. Sometimes I question, I'm like, wait, do we live in the same country? Right? I've been up and down all over this country, 70 different cities, and I'm not seeing what you're seeing. So I think it's a problem because the term is, again, the idea, it's not useful. I don't think it's a useful, beneficial narrative to put into people's brains. I think it's divisive. I think it's disempowering. I think it creates resentment and hostility amongst different groups, and I don't think that's a good thing. I don't want to be looking around this room, looking at everyone by their skin color and their gender and thinking, what's the narrative? How does this fit into my narrative and my power dominance? Like, that's not a good way to look at the world. And then the very last point, which was about the young boys and them getting mixed messages, this comes back to the last thing I was saying, and I think that one of the biggest forms of oppression is to tell people constantly that they are oppressed, right? If you drill that into a boy, a girl, whatever, you keep telling them this narrative that the world is out to get you, you're oppressed, you've got this whole group of people who are trying to keep you down, the system is against you and whatever. To me, that's almost like, if you were to tell that to a child, to me that's almost like child cruelty, right? I'm so glad that my parents never sat me down and told me, oh, you're a young black boy, so the world is going to be so difficult for you. You can't go to Oxford. You're going to have to work 10 times as hard. You're going to have all this. And people do feed people these narratives. You know, the police are going to arrest you on sight. And it's not true. You know, it's not true. And I don't think it's good to tell young girls that the patriarchy is out to get you and that, you know, everything's going to be so hard for you because you're a female. And I don't think it's good to tell young boys that the whole world is out to get you and, you know, whether you're a victim or you're oppressor or whatever it is, it's just not good. It's not positive and it's not true to constantly feed these narratives to people. That's how you oppress them. That's how you keep people enslaved. So I personally fight back against that very hard. So that's all I got to say.
All right, well, I want to thank both our panelists and the audience. I think there were some excellent points there, and you know, any feminist who wants to accuse us of mansplaining the patriarchy, I think now is welcome to tweet us at Ayn Rand Center. All right. So we'll take a 10-minute break, and then we'll be back for the postmodern.